Salam and peace be upon you all. My name is Muhammad Layiq Sadiqi, the father of Holophase. Episode 5, Part 7. Let's pick up the story exactly where we left it. You and I have just walked the universe from bottom to top and back again, watching how time, space, and motion change their character as different bands of phi, the holophase, take over. We have seen the quantum world as the blazing treble of phi, the cosmic structure as its deep bass, and life as the mid-band harmony singing in between. Now comes the part that, if the holophase model is right, quietly changes everything. So far, we have treated the dimensional echoes of phi, time, space, and motion, as if they are just a new way to describe reality. A more elegant and unified description, yes, but still a description sitting on top of something else. In this part, we take a much bolder step. We are going to treat phi and its dimensional echoes as the code from which the laws of physics themselves are written. Not code as a poetic metaphor, but code as in a real engine. The hidden rules that run the whole game. This is the moment where the holophase stops behaving like just a new picture and begins to look like a universal operating system for reality. We are lifting our eyes from the icons on the screen to the operating system underneath. There will be no equations here and no formal derivations. Those belong into our 30-plus papers, which has consumed much of my life. Here, we are going to tell the story in the clearest, most human way possible, using images and analogies you can feel in your body. This is the part of episode 5 where the floor begins to move gently under words like forces, laws, and geometry. They stop being the final explanation and start looking like shadows cast by something deeper. Let us begin with a simple image. Part 1. From map to engine. Imagine yourself playing a video game. On the screen, you see landscapes, characters, objects that move, fall, collide, glow, and explode. You can wander around, push things, jump off ledges, interact with the world. You could spend your whole life cataloging what happens on the screen. You might say things like, "When I walk off this edge, I fall. If I press this button, the character jumps. If I touch that glowing object, I lose health." You could collect these observations and start writing rules. Objects accelerate as they fall. Projectiles travel in arcs. Some regions slow you down as if the air is thicker there. This is what humans did with physics for centuries. We watched the screen of reality and wrote down rules about what we saw. Newton's laws, Maxwell's equations, Einstein's field equations, all of them are refined descriptions of patterns on the screen. But in the video game, there is a deeper level. Behind everything you see on the screen, there is an engine. The game engine decides how things move. It handles collisions, it simulates gravity, it draws the geometry of the world, it updates everything frame by frame. Here is the key point. The rules you see on the screen are derivatives of the engine's deeper logic. If you only study the screen, you can describe what happens and predict a lot. But you never fully understand why the rules are the way they are. You cannot easily unify or change them until you understand the engine. Holophase makes a bold claim. What we call laws of physics, forces, fields, metrics, conservation laws, are like the on-screen behavior of a much deeper engine. The engine's core variable is phi, the holophase. Its frame-by-frame update rules are encoded in how phi changes in time, in space, and through motion. Time, space, and motion are not separate substances. They are the three main readouts of how phi behaves. In this story, time, space, and motion are the dimensional readouts of phi. What we call laws of nature are recurrent patterns in how those readouts behave when phi evolves under certain constraints. In this part, we are going to stand in front of the screen, but then point beyond it. We will look at familiar behaviors and say, that is not a primitive law. That is phi's dimensional code acting in a particular way. We will go through three big moves. First, we will show how the dimensional skeleton of phi behaves like a universal engine. Second, we will use simple examples, a falling apple, a planet's orbit, a vibrating string, to show how familiar laws show up as outputs of this engine. Third, we will ask what it means if this picture is actually true. Part 2. When the skeleton becomes a machine. Earlier, we imagined phi as a tree. The trunk was phi itself. Three main branches grew from the trunk: the time branch, the space branch, and the motion branch. From those, finer branches grew: rates, gradients, curvatures, accelerations, higher orders of change. That tree was a picture, a way of seeing the structure. Now I want you to imagine that tree coming to life. Everywhere along the trunk, phi is oscillating. It is cycling through its angles like a vast, living clock that never stops. On the time branch, the rhythm at a point, the local speed at which phi turns, gives us a sense of local ticking. On the space branch, how phi changes as you move gives you distance, shape, curvature. On the motion branch, how phase patterns drift gives you velocity, acceleration, and flows. Now add one crucial ingredient: constraint. The phase tree cannot simply twist and dance however it wants. There are coherence constraints, symmetries, and consistency conditions that phi has to respect. Neighboring regions of phi must fit together. Phase patterns must evolve in ways that do not tear the structure apart. Certain twists and knots in phi must be carried through time without breaking. These constraints are not external laws imposed from outside. They are more like the internal grammar of phi. Just as a language has rules about how sounds can be combined into words and words into sentences, phi has rules about how phase values can be combined and how they can change together. Here is the key move. The familiar laws of physics are the simplest, most symmetric ways for phi to satisfy its own internal grammar when projected into time, space, and motion. That is the Holophase view in one simple sentence. Newton's laws, Maxwell's equations, Einstein's rules for curvature, and quantum dynamics all become phrases in the language that phi is allowed to speak. They are the simplest sentences that respect its internal grammar across the three dimensions of time, space, and motion. When you see a falling apple, a planet in orbit, or a photon bouncing between mirrors, you are not watching separate laws acting on separate objects. You are watching one phase engine write reality as it unfolds. Let us make that more concrete. Part 3. The falling apple, from force to phase slope. Picture the classic scene: an apple hanging on a branch. At first, it rests quietly in the tree, held up by the stem. Then the stem weakens, the connection breaks, and the apple begins to fall. Traditionally, we say the apple experiences a gravitational force pulling it downward. That force causes an acceleration. The acceleration increases its speed as it falls. And we write in symbols that the force equals mass times acceleration. Holophase does not reject this description. It is extremely useful. But it suggests a deeper narration. Around the Earth, phi is not flat. In the region near the planet, phi has a gradient, a pattern of change with height, a phase slope. You can picture this like a landscape of invisible hills and valleys, drawn not in dirt and rock, but in phase values. As long as the apple is attached to the tree, its pattern in phi is locked in place. The tree is like a rigid scaffold pinning that patch of phase structure to a fixed position on the invisible hill. The apple is sitting on a slope, but nailed to it. When the stem finally breaks, the apple becomes a free phase feature in that region. It is no longer pinned. It is now allowed to move, and the phase slope around it whispers the simplest possible instruction. The simplest way for the pattern to move while keeping the surrounding phase structure coherent is to drift down the slope. The path of steepest descent in phase space becomes the path of motion in ordinary space. From this angle, gravity is not a mysterious force reaching out through empty space and pulling on the apple. It is a rule about how phase gradients in the space branch steer behavior on the motion branch over time. Force, in this story, is a bookkeeping word. It captures the relationship between phase gradient, phase curvature, and the rate at which the motion of a phase pattern changes to reduce mismatch with its environment. To the apple, nothing is pulling. It is simply being carried by the shape of phi. The universe is whispering, through its phase landscape. Here is the path that keeps you in tune with everything around you. Follow this slope if you want to remain in phase. The fall is the on-screen behavior. The shape of phi is the engine underneath. Part 4. Orbits. Sliding along the walls of a phase basin. Now, let us lift our gaze to a more majestic scene. A planet orbiting a star. Traditionally, we say that gravity pulls the planet inward, while its sideways motion keeps it from falling straight in. The inward pull and the sideways motion balance to create an orbit. We draw arrows for forces and little circles for paths. Holophase changes the metaphor again. Imagine the phase field around a star forming a smooth ball, a phase basin. At the bottom of the ball, near the star, the phase curvature is strong. Farther out, the ball gets flatter. The shape you see in your mind might look like a warped trampoline from the usual space-time picture, but here it is purely a landscape of phase values. Now imagine a planet as a coherent patch of phase structure placed somewhere on the inner wall of the ball. If the planet pattern has no sideways motion at all, it simply begins to slide straight down toward the bottom. That is a fall. But if the planet has some sideways component, it does not fall directly in. Instead, it slides along the curved wall, moving forward while always being gently turned inward by the slope. It is like a marble rolling inside a round ball. Its path bends around and around. The orbit that we see from outside is the simplest possible path, where phase curvature, time cadence, and motion all stay in just the right balance. That is the path that keeps the phase pattern coherent, that keeps it aligned with the underlying ball. From this view, the planet is not being pulled by invisible strings. It is coasting through a curved phase landscape, always moving in the direction that allows its time echo, its space echo, and its motion echo to remain consistent with the surrounding phi. If you only study the screen, you say, there is a gravitational force with a particular mathematical form. If you peek underneath in the holophase lens, you say, the phase field has a specific curvature pattern around the star, and the planet's orbit is the simplest, most coherent way for that phase pattern to flow through that curvature over time. The law is no longer a mysterious decree. It is a necessity of phase geometry. Part 5. Waves. The simplest sentences phi can speak. Now let us switch to something more familiar, more gentle, a vibrating string. You plug the string of a guitar or a violin, it shakes. A wave travels along it, reflects at the ends, interferes with itself, and settles into standing patterns. If you pluck it just right, you get a pure musical note. Traditional physics writes down a wave equation. It relates how the displacement of the string changes in time to how it changes in space. It tells you how waves travel, how fast, how they add up. Holophase offers another way of telling the story. Think of the string as a narrow window on phi. Along that line of string, phi is structured in a limited way. When you pluck the string, you disturb the phase order along this one-dimensional channel. Phi then tries to repair coherence. It wants neighboring bits of phase to line up again in an allowed pattern. The simplest way to repair the disturbance while respecting its internal grammar is to send the disturbance traveling along the string as a wave. The cleanest waves, the ones that fit the boundaries perfectly, are the standing modes we call harmonics. A wave, in this story, is not a little thing moving through a medium. It is a simple sentence in phi's language, spoken along a line. The wave equation is not a command from outside, but a compact description of how phi's time behavior and space behavior are allowed to co-evolve in that one-dimensional slice. This pattern repeats everywhere. Sound waves in air, light waves in vacuum, matter waves in quantum mechanics. In each case, the details change, the medium changes, the maths changes, but the logic is the same. The phase engine only allows certain patterns. Those allowed patterns become waves. So Holophase does not arbitrarily force everything to be wave-like. It notices that the universe already behaves as if there is a deep phase engine that permits only certain coherent patterns of change, and that these patterns show up as waves. Holophase then dares to say, let us stop treating this wave behavior as an accident and treat it as the primary language of reality. Part 6. Forces as tension, laws as grammar. Let us step back and see what ties these examples together. We have seen a falling apple as motion in a phase slope. We have seen a planet's orbit as sliding along the walls of a phase basin. We have seen waves as simple sentences that phi speaks when disturbed. All of these share a single shift. We move from saying force causes motion to saying the shape and rhythm of phi restrict which motions are even possible. Force becomes a summarizing word for something deeper. There is a mismatch between where phase patterns are and where phi's geometry wants them to be. That mismatch creates a kind of tension, and the system moves in a way that reduces that tension while preserving coherence. Think of stretching a rubber sheet. When you let go, it snaps back. Not because some invisible force decides to act, but because the sheet has a preferred shape, and your stretched configuration did not match it. The bounce back is simply the sheet returning toward the shape that fits its material constraints. Holophase says, phi has preferred coherence configurations tied to its symmetries and internal grammar. When you disturb phi into a configuration that does not fit, the phase engine drives the system toward more coherent patterns. We describe that drive as gravitational force, electromagnetic force, pressure, tension, and so on. The laws of physics, in this view, are not commandments coming from outside. They are grammatical constraints on how phi is allowed to change while preserving coherence across its dimensional echoes. Just as grammar rules tell you which sentences are allowed in a language, the laws tell you which phase evolutions are allowed in reality. This is why, in the deep technical work, so many laws can be derived from more abstract principles like symmetry and minimal action. Once you assume a phase engine with certain symmetries and constraints, many of the familiar laws become inevitable. They are simply the shortest, cleanest sentences that phi can speak under those rules. In the audio language we are using here, you could say, laws are allowed sentences in phi's grammar. Forces are phase correction drives that push configurations back toward coherence. Geometry is the projected shape of phi's spatial and temporal structure, seen from the outside. If this is true, then nothing we call a law is truly fundamental. Only phi and its internal grammar are fundamental. Everything else is dialogue. Part 7. Everything is connected in phase language. Now, let us touch a phrase you have heard many times. Everything in the universe is connected. In vague spiritual language, this becomes all is one. In sloppy pseudoscientific language, it becomes everything is energy. Holophase offers a more precise way of honoring the same intuition. Instead of saying everything is energy, it says everything is embedded in one phase field, one phi. When phi changes anywhere, the conditions for coherent evolution change everywhere. Not in the sense of spooky instant influence that breaks causality, but in a logical sense. The phase engine wants the whole story to remain coherent. Local events are always chapters in a global narrative. When one chapter changes, the possibilities for later chapters adjust. That is the deepest reason Holophase treats time, space, and motion together. You cannot fix coherence in just one of them. If something changes in time, the allowed patterns in space and motion must respond. If something changes in space, the time evolution and motion patterns must shift. There are three aspects of one ongoing harmony. This is why, in general relativity, a change in energy distribution curves spacetime. This is why changing the properties of a medium changes how waves propagate. This is why altering boundaries reshapes allowed modes. In holophase terms, these varied facts become versions of a single line. If you change phi structure anywhere, you change the grammar of allowed patterns everywhere else. So when we say everything interacts with everything, holophase translates that as everything shares the same phi. All local events are written in the same phase language. You are not an isolated blob in a dead universe. You are a local paragraph in the unfolding of one phase field. And every breath you take is written in the same language as galaxies, photons, and black holes. Part 8. A more honest notion of fundamental. Now let us come to the word fundamental. Over history, physics has shifted its candidate for what is truly fundamental. At one time, fundamental meant tiny hard particles. Then it meant fields. Then it meant spacetime geometry plus fields. At each step we said, this time we have reached the bottom. Holophase does not claim to be the final answer, but it does change the kind of answer we are allowed to give. It suggests that the most fundamental thing in our description of reality is not a substance, not a specific kind of stuff, but a structure. A continuous ordering, a cyclic phase field, and its patterns of change. In that worldview, energy is how we count certain patterns of phase activity. Matter is regions where phase is knotted into stable structures that resist being smoothed out. Forces are tendencies of phi to redistribute or repair coherence. Spacetime geometry is the shadow, in our coordinates, of deeper phase structures. The only thing that remains primitive is the existence of phi itself, the fact that there is a global cyclic order, and the internal grammar of how that order can change. Reality, in this story, is not built from little blocks, but from rhythm with rules. A rhythm that differentiates into time, space, and motion. A rhythm that shapes the allowed laws. A rhythm that writes every phenomenon as a chapter in its evolving structure. You can think of it like this. The universe is not made of Lego. It is made of music. Not sound, but abstract music. Patterns in time and space, woven in a strict but fertile grammar. All of physics is our attempt to reverse engineer the score from the piece we find ourselves inside. Part 9. How this picture can be wrong. A story can be beautiful and still be wrong. Holophase does not escape that risk. It does not want to. In fact, it demands to be tested, to be exposed to the possibility of failure. Here is one way to express that demand. Whenever we have a stable domain of physics where we can write predictive laws using time, space, and motion, Holophase claims that there must exist a representation in which those laws appear as constraints on a single phase field and its derivatives. In plain words, whenever physics talks about time, space, and motion, those three should be re-expressible as echoes of phi, and the laws should be re-expressible as rules in phi's grammar. If we discover a domain where time, space, and motion work beautifully in our equations, but no matter how we try, we cannot find a coherent phase-based description underneath, then the strong form of holophase is wrong. Not slightly wrong, wrong in its core. That is the promise this story makes with reality. It does not ask for belief because it is poetic. It asks to be attacked with data and mathematics. It says, give me your best physics, your strangest regimes. I claim there is a phase-based description underneath them. If you can build a domain where that is provably impossible, you have killed this model. Until that happens, holophase does not replace physics. It works as a reduction and unification program. Everything physics already describes, plus the parts it struggles to unify, recast as chapters in one phase narrative. Part 10. Where this takes us next. Let us step back and look at what we have done in this episode. We started by reminding ourselves that time, space, and motion can be seen as three echoes of phi. We then walked across scales and watched how those echoes change as different bands of phi dominate. The blazing quantum treble, the human midband, the cosmic bass. In this part, we took the daring step of saying that these echoes are not just descriptions. They are the surface behavior of a deeper phase engine, a universal operating system for reality. We reread the falling apple, the orbiting planet, and the vibrating string as simple sentences in phi's grammar. We reinterpreted forces as phase correction drives, laws as grammatical rules, and geometry as the shadow of phase structure. From here, the next steps in the holophase journey become clear. We will begin to build bridges between this phase engine view and the familiar concepts of mass, inertia, fields, thermodynamics, information, and even cognition. We will ask how mass emerges from stubborn phase patterns that resist deformation. We will ask how fields appear as different ways of organizing phase variation in space. We will explore how information can be seen as phase structure that you can recover and use to anticipate the future of phi. But all of that depends on one deep shift that this episode has been building toward. Stop treating time, space, motion, and energy as the deepest things. Start treating them as dimensional shadows of a more fundamental rhythm. Once that shift settles in your mind, the world looks different. Every clock becomes a phase counter. Every ruler becomes a phase comparator. Every speedometer becomes a phase flow gauge. Every law becomes a sentence in phi's grammar. Every event, from a neuron firing to a supernova exploding, becomes phi speaking. And somewhere inside this single, vast speaking phase, you and I are sitting here, a local ripple in the holophase, trying for the first time to read the code of existence in its own native language. That is what makes this part of the holophase project so quietly astonishing. We are not just digging a little bit deeper into physics. We are rotating the entire picture. We are asking, what if reality has always been one great ordered rhythm? And all of physics, all of history, and all of life are just the ways that rhythm has learned to hear itself.